Neverending Nightmares is a game that draws people in with its black and white crosshatch style, but does it deliver anything more than an interesting art design? Atmosphere. Whilst the stark but often murky look of the game is the main attraction, the main thing that keeps this game's atmosphere going is its tense meanderings through the different areas. As the game progresses, the dreamlike quality and darkness-induced claustrophobia, coupled with a feeling of hopelessness, certainly intensifies but never becomes overwhelming. The slowly deteriorating house, cobwebs, collection of strange paintings and dolls add to the atmosphere, but it's mostly cliché additions that don't add a great deal to the overall feel. Even as the game progresses to the asylum, the slow gameplay and cliché tropes of such a place don't add as much as it could have to enhance the experience. It seems the majority of the atmosphere is brought on by the visuals and tense gameplay, but often the gameplay itself is what breaks down the atmosphere sometimes by being just too slow. The game certainly delivers a creepy vibe on looks and gameplay alone though. 1 Harry Mason. Scares. Most of the game's scares come from sudden jump scares that sometimes feel cheap, and when they don't work, they really fall flat. Some of the better, more well-executed ones are at the start or end of the game when the player is at their most unaware. Enemies in the game are either really easily outsmarted or avoided, or like the patients in the asylum are sometimes too difficult to avoid and stop being frightening when they start becoming frustrating, and most of them aren't that frightening to begin with. The game doesn't have a lot more to offer in the way of scares, which is disappointing. That's still 1 Harry Mason. Sound design. Whilst the soundtrack to the game is interesting, a lot of it didn't really seem to match what was going on for certain parts of the game, with nauseating drones, repetitive monotonous motifs, and broken melodies fluttering in when nothing much was happening on the screen. I disabled the soundtrack to add it later for editing purposes, and found the eerie silence of just the sound effects made me more uneasy than the relentless bombardment of the later pieces of the soundtrack. The sound effects themselves are pretty decent. A lot of the jump scare tones I've heard in many other games, and the monsters themselves often sound uninspired. It's mediocre, but it could have been so much more. That's still 1 Harry Mason. Gore. With red being one of the only visible colours in the game, blood is always vividly portrayed. A lot of the rare cutscenes are of self-mutilation and really stand out a lot in comparison to the otherwise mundane traversing of the game. Ripping veins out of your arm and forcing your hand into a meat grinder are images that will stick with you long after the game is finished. That's 2 Harry Masons. Story. Being based on a nightmare, the story doesn't make a great deal of sense, with things changing on a whim. Your sister is now your wife is leaving you and taking your child you didn't know you had. The addition of multiple endings doesn't make a great deal of difference when the game doesn't make a lot of sense. Plus, after playing the game 3 times, I've never been able to find any of the other endings, making the final score 2 out of 5 Harry Masons. I'd like to say that I didn't think that Neverending Nightmares is a bad horror game despite having a low score. Often it hits its mark, but when it doesn't, it doesn't. The game only lasts about an hour and a half and it shouldn't have cost as much as it did, but there's a solid experience in here underneath the frankly slow gameplay. Again, I'd like to remind you the whole thing is down to my opinion on horror games, and if you don't share this opinion, then that's cool, I get it. I'd like to point out that whilst I did have a hard time forgetting the veins cutscene, I did not scream like a banshee or run away from the computer, and I'd advise you don't either. There'll be more horror reviews in the pipeline, and thanks for watching, and always go check out Bumps in the Middle of the Night. Peace.